welcome almost 100 participants this morning for this is the fifth week of our spring session. Richard Brooke is going to tell us about propaganda today in the U.S. war effort. I want to just tell people, because you all know that this is being recorded, and people that miss it or have to leave early or want to go back or share it with family, you can check on demand on the OLLI website and get the recording on your computer. And I found out that these recordings are going to be available all summer. So you don't have to rush to learn it all this week and next. So enjoy the session this morning, and everybody have a great day. Turning it over to Richard.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well this morning. One little correction. We were going to have a guest lecturer this week who was going to talk to you about propaganda during the war, but because of the fact that the COVID crisis happened, the meeting that I was going to be attending out of town never happened. So you're getting me instead, and today we're going to actually talk about the Nuremberg war crimes trials. So the propaganda discussion's out and the Nuremberg war crimes trials are in. So hopefully you'll enjoy this session. This is, as we heard, is the fifth out of the sixth that I'm doing. We've actually managed to make it mostly through the war at this point, and nobody, I think, has been particularly wounded. Hopefully not. We haven't lost too many people to the North Koreans, who may have scooped up a few people as a result of the atomic bomb discussion. And I don't know of anyone who's actually gone to England to go to work on that for cracking the code. So at this point, all we can say is that we're all in good shape and in the home stretch. So today I wanted to talk with you guys about the Nuremberg war crimes trials, which happened, of course, at the end of the war. We're going to talk about several of the trials that happened because there were actually more than one. There was actually quite a few of them. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the more important and interesting ones. We're going to talk about the main one, however, mostly. We're going to talk about the defendants and the crimes they were charged with and the sentences that were meted out by the International Tribunal. I also want to cover the history of how the individual crimes actually became a crime in law is quite interesting. Now, I am not a lawyer, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so we're safe on that regard. No matter what you end up thinking about the trials, they have an enduring legacy, and it's interesting to understand the legal basis of how it came to pass that each one of the crimes that was mentioned in the war crimes trials actually became an actual crime. Now, this is a little bit of a complicated subject today, and it's definitely viewed differently by the different participants who had a role in the trials. So I'm going to try to explain a little bit about where each of the different countries was coming from and how it looked to the Germans from the discussions that I've had with other Germans from being in Germany. But we're going to just go through this, and hopefully you'll get a flavor for what happened after the war. For the Allies, when the war ended, they really were trying to accomplish a few very important key things. The first, definitely, is that they wanted justice for the millions and millions of victims from the war. The second is that after two world wars in the same century, there was a desire for the victors to get credit for having actually rescued Europe not once but twice in the same century. They wanted that recognition for the blood and treasure that they had spent in defeating the Nazis. They wanted public trials so that future generations of the world would see what the Nazis did. And if you think about it, the fact that we have future generations now, it's been quite some time, they've actually accomplished that. They have definitely ingrained the war crimes trials and the idea of a war crimes trial in people's heads. They wanted the world to see that the Allies were not seeking revenge against the German people, but were in fact trying to extract a measure of justice as best they could. They wanted to show the German people exactly what sort of leaders they had followed, over the cliff and into the abyss. They wanted to definitely paint a picture that showed exactly what had been going on in Germany so that Germans couldn't hide from it. They definitely wanted that. And the other thing that they wanted is that they really wanted the German people to recognize that these crimes were not just committed by their leaders, but also within the lower ranks, both in the regular army and the SS. So they went way out of their way to bring in testimony that showed this. But after 2 world wars in 30 years, more than 100 million dead, and between all of the Allies, what they really wanted to do is they wanted to come up with a set of rules that would keep this from happening again. So this is what they were trying to accomplish when they were coming up with this idea of doing the war crimes trials. Now, this main trial that we're going to talk about initially here took place in the city of Nuremberg, which, if you look at my map here, is located in the southern part of Germany here in Bavaria, not far from Munich, where Dachau is located. Actually, Flossenburg is not too far. It's just over here. So this was the center of National Socialism. In fact, the Hall of Justice, where the trial actually took place, was only 2 miles from the Nazi parade grounds, where many of you who've watched videos online or on TV have seen hundreds of thousands of Germans marching back and forth, singing the Horst Whistle song and screaming Heil Hitler. This all happened right in Nuremberg. The dead, after the war, were screaming out for justice, and this is where they were going to try to extract a measure of that justice. So I think, just to get you started, I want to throw up a definition of what the Allies were thinking when they were thinking about the word justice. So this is sort of the textbook definition, which I'll let you read here. It talks about determining the rights according to the rule of law or equity, establishing a method by which equity could be extracted from bad behavior. This was the idea of what they were after when they came up with the idea that they were after justice. So this is where it all started. And hopefully when we're done today, I really want you to sit down and talk with your friends about whether or not you think we've lived up to this definition, because it's quite complicated. So let's roll back and go back to the idea of where the concept came from for getting the war crimes trials off the ground. The idea really was cemented when the Allies met at Yalta in February of 1945. Now, among the 3 big post-war issues that were discussed here, among the big 3, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, they had come up with the idea that they got to have a plan for dealing with the serious crimes that the Nazis had been committing during the war. Previously in Casablanca, which had happened 2 years ago when they had a conference there, and as more and more details of what was going on in Eastern Europe with the Jews had leaked out, they had publicly warned the Germans at Casablanca that individuals who committed war crimes would be severely punished after the war. Now, it wasn't just the Nazi penchant for murdering Jews that was on their mind, but it was indeed the mass murder that was going on behind the German lines of innocent civilians all over the place. It wasn't just relegated to Eastern Europe, but country after country, as they fell under the Nazi boot, they were suffering from a brutal murdering Nazis running around causing havoc behind the lines, and the Allies were really trying to warn them. But, you know, it wasn't just that they were murdering civilians. In fact, they were turning on captured POWs, something that had been banned after World War I. And they were busy murdering soldiers in uniform. They were busy murdering sailors on the high seas. Anyone that got in their way was fair game. And the big 3 had hoped that with a public pronouncement about war crimes, they could make the Nazis think twice about all the carnage that they were reaping across Europe. So at Yalta, the pressure was on to come up with an actual plan to make good on the promises that they'd made at Casablanca. So, in fact, at the time, it wasn't even obvious that a trial was going to be a good idea. And why was that? Well, it was because after World War I, the Allies had attempted to have some trials for Germans, but the whole thing had ended in a failure. So it was not a foregone conclusion that a trial would even work. Stalin, in fact, really was against the idea of a trial. Stalin's idea, you know, it was Stalin, of course, he suggested that the Allies just take the top 50,000 or 100,000 Nazis and shoot them in the head. That was his idea. That was sort of justice Russian style. And of course, it turns out Stalin had done exactly this during the war with the Polish officer corps. in the Kachin forest in 1941 that they had captured when they had invaded Poland. So he was no stranger to doing this sort of thing. And of course, he was no stranger to murdering his own people. So this solution really wasn't anything new to him. It was sort of shocking to Roosevelt and Churchill. And, they weren't amused by this, but they didn't have the complete say. And it turns out that even though they pressed hard with Stalin and actually won him over eventually to have a trial, there was a point even during the trial when Churchill was really beginning to think that the whole thing had been a bad idea, as it had been after World War I. And at one point, Churchill was advocating in the middle of the trials that maybe what they should have done is had just a court-martial and executions of the worst of the bunch. But anyway, from Yalta, they actually agreed that they were going to have the post-war trial that we know as the Nuremberg war crimes trials. So they proposed a tribunal to put on the trial that started the war, a war that became the greatest war of aggression and crime against peace launched by one country against another in the history of mankind. And of course, if you think about what I just said, launched by one country against another, problem, right away, we have a problem. And that problem is that Germany wasn't acting alone when the war started. The Germans had allies, and of course, we know who they were. Russia was one of those allies. When Germany attacked Poland from the west, we know a week later, Russia attacked Poland, from the east. Well, then there's this inconvenient fact that Stalin had ordered the brutal, cold-blooded murder of the Polish officer corps that I just mentioned in Kachin, in Smolensk in 1941. Now, actually, that sounds pretty much like a war crime, doesn't it? Well, okay. Furthermore, making things even more complicated, in addition to invading Poland, the Russians, when the war started, when they attacked Poland, they also attacked who? They attacked Finland. So you can see the problem here. The Russians and the Germans made a pact at the start of the war, and both attacked at the same time. But somehow, wait a minute, somehow only the Germans were responsible for starting the war. You can see it's easy to get a headache when you're talking about this. So when Russia attacked Finland, much to everyone's surprise, what happened? Well, it turns out the Finns beat them up pretty badly. Stalin had murdered most of his top officers in the 20s and 30s. So when he attacked, of course, his officers were pretty green, and they weren't very good. So the Finns actually beat them. In the invasion that happened in the winter of 1939 and 1940, it actually ended with the Finns beating back the Russians, who were forced to sign a peace treaty. Okay, well, never mind treaties. The Russians attacked Finland again the very next year. And this time, they had been better trained, so they brought their A game. And the fight went on and on. When Nazi Germany turned on their Russian allies and invaded to the east, it gets even more complicated. What happened? Turns out the Finns ended up allying themselves with the Germans against the Russians. Well, you know the old story, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, really, just to make your head totally explode, several hundred Finnish Jews happily joined the Finnish army and fought alongside the Nazis against the Russians. Wow, getting complicated. So this Finnish war continued right up until the end almost of World War II. In fact, the Finns were under so much pressure from the Allies to make peace with the Russians or risk being treated as a German ally that Finland left the Russians occupying almost 10% of Finland. They just had to quit the war. And guess what? 75 years later, they're still waiting to get their land back. Good luck with that. To further complicate matters, when Germany and Russia attacked Poland, another German ally, the Italians, launched a war in North Africa, in Albania. We haven't even gotten started, and you can see it's getting really complicated. And then there's the matter of the collaborating Vichy French that we've talked about. They committed all kinds of crimes during the war, all kinds of war crimes. Anyhow, Stalin said that if the Allies want Russian participation at Nuremberg trials, no Russians could be charged. Okay, well, how about the Italians? Unfortunately, the Italians complicated things by switching sides and joining the Allies and fighting the Germans. We all remember that. When the Allies invaded Italy, Italy switched sides. Another sticky mess, because the British and the Americans didn't want to do anything to Italy that would push the Italians into becoming a post-war ally with the Russians. So there was already a large and growing communist problem in Greece after the war, where communists were pushing for Greece to align with the Soviets rather than with the West in post-war Europe. So stopping Russian expansion was becoming a major consideration. Therefore, no Italians would be tried. Well, now how about some Croats who happily murdered people at the concentration camp at Jasenovac? Nope. Marshal Tito, who was taking over in Yugoslavia, was allied with the Russians. And the Russians, as I just said, weren't going to allow that. So the Croats were also off the hook. Now, how about some of the collaborating Vichy, who were happily rounding up and shipping thousands of Jews off to their deaths in France? Nope. De Gaulle would have nothing of it. So the Vichy scourge would be swept under the rug in favor of the story that I already told you about, that being the heroic French resisting the Boche in the French underground. Never mind that 99.9% of those who claimed to have joined the French underground did so the night before their liberation. So the net result, no Vichy were on trial either. So the de facto answer became Germans only. Small problem. How do you suppose the Germans felt about this? Well, of course, what do you think they said? They said, I thought this was about justice, and now it's Germans only. So the Germans started calling it what? They called it victor's justice. And that idea among Germans continues to this day. Not among all Germans, but certainly among many that have read a lot about the book trials, come to this conclusion. The Germans, it turns out, they don't even call it the Nuremberg trials. They call it the Nuremberg process. So I'm going to show you how that manifests itself in Germany today, here, right now. So this is the Palace of Justice, where the trials took place in Nuremberg. Beautiful old building. It's actually the municipal courthouse today, and you can go inside. We're going to go inside in a minute. You can see those big flags sitting out front. Those are, in fact, part of the museum that's there. It's an enormous sign that declares for all to see exactly what you're going to see when you go inside. And when we go inside, or as you approach those flags, you can see exactly what they say. Well, on the American flag, you have in German written what? The Nuremberg process. On the British flag, it says the Nuremberg trials. On the Russian flag, sorry, I don't know what it says, can't read it. But on the French flag, it actually says the Nuremberg process. It doesn't say trials, it says the Nuremberg process. Very complicated, but depending on how the different parties see this. And of course, this is also the interpretation of what the people who built the museum have to say about what each party thinks about the situation. So it's really complicated. It really is quite complicated. But the four victorious allies, the US, Russia, Britain, and France, agreed on an international military tribunal that was going to be held inside the Palace of Justice right there in Nuremberg. And this is what the room looks like. So you can visit the place. On the day that I visited, you could actually get inside and see what the room looked like that had been used for the trials. This is how the room looks today. Doesn't look anything like how the room looked during the war crimes trials, but you can actually see how the room was actually aligned. This door here that you see here is actually this door. So this photo should be rotated by about 90 degrees or so, and then it would match up. And then this door is actually this door right here that you can just see here. So the defendants were sitting here. They had guards behind them. The attorneys were here, and the judges were over here on this side. And then there were people who were watching the trial over in the foreground here in the picture. But the building exists today, and this is a regularly used municipal courtroom. Imagine getting tried for your parking fine in the same room where this was all happening. But room 63 is where all this happened. And the courts were going to be bound under international law and the laws of war. We're going to come back to this and talk about this a little bit more. But in the end, there were a number of trials, but the first trial held before the International Military Tribunal is the best known, and the only one that was tried before 4 judges for one each from all the main allies. Now on trial here were the main Nazis, including members of the political, military, judicial, and economic leadership. Basically, those who planned, carried out, or otherwise participated in starting the war, and those responsible for the Holocaust and all the other war crimes that were committed during the course of the war. But there's a caveat, and here's the problem. The room only had 22 seats in the dock, and the 4 powers didn't want this to drag out indefinitely. So actually, if you look here, there's basically room for 22 defendants. And the 4 powers didn't want this to drag out indefinitely. So what did they do? They told the prosecutors, okay, guys, pick the worst of the bunch, and that will have to do. That's going to have to be good enough, which is a rather interesting way to pick the number of defendants. 22 chairs, 22 defendants. Well, what about the thousands of others? Okay, perhaps you're beginning to notice that it's getting complicated. But anyway, we're keeping going. The trial took 11 months and ran between November the 20th of 1945 and October the 1st of 1946. So the prosecutors first created a list of the top and worst surviving 24 Nazis, and they picked a few spares just in case. Among the 24, they picked Martin Bormann, who had disappeared at the end of the war. He was tried in absentia, no seat required for him. Then somehow they realized that one guy on the list, a guy by the name of Gustav Krupp, the CEO of Krupp AG, a huge industrial conglomerate that had used hundreds of thousands of slave laborers to build weapons during the war. Turns out Gustav Krupp had been in a coma since 1941. Huh? In a coma? Well, seems that somehow his name made it onto the list when they really wanted his son Alfred. Now, this error ended up getting the list whittled down to 22. Alfred, the son, probably thought he dodged a bullet, but no such luck. He ended up getting his very own Nuremberg trial. We're going to come back to that later. Another of the indicted, a guy by the name of Robert Ley, who was head of the German Labor Front, well, he decided to end his problems early by committing suicide right after the trial started. So turns out they ended up with 21 defendants. So let's go through them. First of all, Martin Bormann, the guy they tried in absentia, Nazi Party secretary, a big Hitler advisor. Karl Dönitz, the head of the Navy. Hans Frank, who had been the author of the Nuremberg laws and had been very active in Poland during the war. A radio commentator who worked for Goebbels by the name of Hans Fritsch. Wilhelm Frick, who was the Minister of the Interior, the governor of the Czechoslovakia, and a co-author of the Nuremberg laws. Walther Funk, who was the head of the Reichsbank, Minister of Economics, and he succeeded another guy named Schacht, who is going to come up on the next page. Göring, who everybody's heard of, the head of the Air Force, the number 2 Nazi behind Hitler. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy who took off and flew to Scotland in 1941. Alfred Jodl, who worked for Keitel at the military headquarters. He actually signed the Commissar order, which also specified the execution of commandos. Turns out this Commissar order is what got a lot of these people into deep trouble. Let me just explain briefly what that is. When they invaded Russia, when Germany invaded Russia, they got it into their heads that it would be a good idea to murder the political operatives who were embedded in the Russian military. So these were Russians who were wearing Russian military uniforms. They were fighting to a certain degree, but they were also there to check on the purism of the Soviets that were fighting. Of course, they also were ratting people out and getting other Russians murdered, but they were basically political officers that were embedded in the army. And Hitler decided it would be a good idea just to murder those people outright. Turns out murdering POWs, totally banned, was banned after World War I. And everybody who touched what they call the Commissar order, if you were a German officer and you passed it down the chain of command to people in the field who were busy murdering commissars, it always ended up getting you in trouble. So this was one of the things that they cited in trying some of these guys. Now, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was the highest member of the SS who went on trial. He was also involved at Mauthausen, and he also was the head of the Einsatzgruppen, which had been responsible for so many murders. After the German army entered Russia, the Einsatzgruppen went in behind them and was responsible for much of the murdering. William Keitel, who was the head of the OKW. The OKW is like the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Keitel was the head of the Joint Chiefs, or the OKW. Keitel was also the author of this Commissar order, and that was going to get him into deep trouble. Konstantin von Neurath, a foreign minister during the 30s when Hitler came to power, another governor of Czechoslovakia before Reinhard Heydrich, but he actually resigned in 1943, but that still ended up on trial. It didn't save him. Franz von Papen, vice chancellor in the 30s and ambassador to Turkey in 1944. Erich Raeder, who was the head of the Navy before Karl Dönitz, was the guy that originally designed the U-boat strategy. Joachim von Ribbentrop was their foreign minister. He's the guy who made deals with Italy, Japan, and Russia before the war, but he was the foreign minister throughout the war. Alfred Rosenberg, who was a top Nazi who was involved in racial theories. He also had been active in the Eastern occupied territories during the course of the war. Fritz Sockel, who was head of the slave labor program between 1941 and 1945. Hjalmar Schacht was the economics minister during the period before the war. Schacht actually got involved in the plot to kill Hitler in July of 44. He was actually thrown into prison for having participated in that plot and ultimately lucky to have not been executed. He ended up spending the war in many of the concentration camps that we have learned about over the past couple of weeks. And he ended up on was something that I call Kaltenbrunner's bus. Ernst Kaltenbrunner at the end of the war piled a whole bunch of people onto a bus who had been opposing Hitler. We're going to learn more about them next week. But he tried to trade them at the end of the war to the Allies in exchange for his own miserable life. The Allies totally refused. Ultimately, the people who were on that bus survived the bus ride, but Kaltenbrunner was threatening to kill them unless the Allies would give him a pass. Schacht was one of those people that was on that bus. And then a few more. Baldur von Schurach, the head of the Hitler Youth Program. He also was the person who started the Lebensborn program. That was the program that sent German officers to Norway and Sweden, to Norway, to have relations with the local Norwegian girls who were viewed to be Aryan. And this was an idea that they had to create more Aryans. That was called the Lebensborn program. There's actually some very famous people who were part of that program. You may have heard of the band ABBA, for instance. Turns out the blonde in ABBA was a Lebensborn. We're going to talk a little bit more about her next week. Arthur Seyss-Inquart was Frank's deputy in Poland, and he was the governor of the Netherlands during the war. Albert Speer was the armaments minister who was heavily involved in slave labor. He came to power when Todt, the guy, his predecessor, was killed in a plane crash in 42. And then this Julius Streicher guy, who was a leading Nazi from before the war, had published a magazine called Der Stürmer. So these were the main people that were involved in the as the defendants in the trial. Now let's go through the legal basis for the trial. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about where these crimes came from. So the legal basis for the trial was established by the London Charter, and sometimes that was called the Nuremberg Charter. We're going to talk about what that is, but let's go through and talk about some of the crimes that became front and center in the Nuremberg war crimes trial. The first one was something that they called a crime against peace, and the history of this legal crime dates back to 1928 to a pact that was called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and it stated that the high contracting parties solemnly declare in the names of their respective peoples that they condemn recourse to war for the solution of international controversies and renounce it as an instrument of national policy. So this was something that happened after World War I. It was reaffirmed in Rome a few years later as part of the League of Nations, and eventually became part of the UN Charter. But back in 1928, it was actually signed by 71 countries, including the Germans. That's important because, of course, that meant they were bound to it. The U.S., Russia, Britain, France, and a number of others. But it had some interesting effects. The first effect that it had is that countries stopped declaring war on each other. Aha! Well, we've all heard about that before, haven't we? But this is why it started like that, is because they made it a crime to do that. So Japan invaded Manchuria, no declaration of war. Italy invaded Abyssinia in Africa, no declaration of war. The Spanish had a civil war, no declarations. The Soviets invaded Finland without a declaration of war, and both of them invaded Poland without a declaration of war. That's a problem. Okay, anywhere. And anyway, the overriding problem was that nowhere in the pact was there any sort of an agreement on what the consequences of breaking the rule was going to be. That's a problem too. So the next thing they charged people with were something about that they called wars of aggression. And this grew out of a London conference from 1933, a follow-up of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, where they tried to define what aggression meant. I'll let you read what it says. You can read it as good as I can. But this was ultimately signed by the Russians, by Poland, and a few others. But even by 1933, you can already see things starting to break down. There's infighting at the conference. Why? Lithuania says, well, we're not going to sign it if Poland is included in the pact. Why is that? Well, no doubt the Lithuanians had some complaint against Poland, and they didn't want to put themselves in a position where if they were to launch a war against Poland, that it would be defined as a war of aggression. So they're already squabbling amongst each other. And again, we have this problem that nowhere in the pact is there any agreement on what the consequences of breaking the agreement are to be. This was a big problem. Then we get to war crimes. War crimes is interesting in that it actually predates even World War I. This took shape in a Hague Convention in 1899 and 1907. Turns out our good friend Teddy Roosevelt opened a series of international treaties after he won the Nobel Peace Prize, where he tried to push some of these types of rules for war along. And in fact, he was somewhat successful. He got the US to participate, Britain, Uruguay, Brazil, Russia, France. Sorry, the Germans didn't attend. They passed some laws, they passed some agreements, but again, no consequences, and no Germany for that matter. Now we get to crimes against humanity. Well, now crimes against humanity is the one we've probably heard a lot about. It actually grew out of this London Charter that I just mentioned. And what they decided is that murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population before or during the war, or persecutions on political, racial, or religious grounds in execution of or in connection with any crime within the jurisdiction of the tribunal, whether or not in violation of domestic law of the country where perpetrated. Now that last bit's pretty interesting, whether or not in violation of the domestic law of the country where perpetrated. So basically, the tribunal was going to say, no matter where you committed this crime, whether it was in Germany or Poland or Russia, didn't matter. Whatever the laws were in those domestic countries, didn't matter. We were going to hold you to account for a crime against humanity if we found you guilty of a crime against humanity. And in fact, if you read here, this is what the tribunal actually ruled. This was a ruling by Robert Jackson from the actual war crimes trial, and I'll let you read it. But basically, it goes on to say they were committed in execution of or in connection with aggressive war, and therefore constituted war crimes against humanity. So if you get a sense that these crimes became crimes just before the trial, and they convicted these people during the trial, this is really what happened. And it was really the men and the judges who were actually doing their best, trying to figure out how to bring these people to justice, that managed to get this done. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be able to call on the Nuremberg war crimes trials as an event in history that had any meaning. But in August of 45, the Allies met in London to set down these rules and the procedures for the trials. They defined these four categories that I just mentioned: crimes against peace, launching a war of aggression, war crimes, and this crimes against humanity. Obedience to orders would only be considered as a mitigation of punishment if the tribunal determined that justice so required. So they left it open that obedience to orders could be used as mitigation, but they might reject it as well. The charter, as you see here, was drafted by Robert Jackson, who, by the way, was a Supreme Court Justice of the U.S., Robert Falco, a British judge, and Iona Nikitchenko, who was a Russian judge. They all became judges at Nuremberg. Now, we've gone through what these different crimes are all about. Let's talk a little bit about what happened during the trial. Robert Jackson, who was a member of the Supreme Court, he led the U.S. prosecution, along with a British prosecutor by the name of Sir David Maxwell Fyfe. Each defendant that we already introduced here in the story today had their own mini-trial and was defended by a German attorney. The prosecutors rotated among the defendants. And the prosecution case was actually divided into two parts. The first part of the trial focused on establishing the criminality of the Nazi regime, while the second sought to establish the guilt or innocence of the individual defendants. The prosecution presented the case with, the prosecution started by presenting every aspect of each German invasion that occurred at the start of the war. They talked about the invasion of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, just as you saw in the first slide presentation that I did. Then Denmark, then Norway, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, Greece, Yugoslavia, and then the Soviet Union, all presented as crimes against peace and wars of aggression. Prosecution proof on the counts of conspiring to wage and then waging an aggressive war consisted mostly of Germans, the Germans' own evidence, because they kept incredible records. You know, they love records. They like writing everything down. Well, those records came back to haunt them because the Allies got a hold of them and used them as the documentary evidence in this part of the trial. From here, they went on to show that Nazis had been using slave labor as a workforce and how they were running concentration camps. They were using movies and witnesses during the course of the trial. On December 13th of 1945, U.S. prosecutor Thomas Todd showed the tanned human tattooed skin from a concentration camp that had been preserved by Ilse Koch, the wife of the commandant of Buchenwald in Majdanek, who we talked about in the previous presentation. She liked to have the flesh fashioned into lampshades. Maybe you've heard that story about making skin into lampshades. This was Ilse Koch. Then Todd introduced a flat-shaped shrunken head of an executed Pole, who also was abused by Koch, who used it as a paperweight. Then on December 18th, the prosecution began introducing evidence to establish the criminality of the Nazi Party leadership, the cabinet, the SS, the Gestapo, the SD, the SA, and even the German High Command. Some of the evidence was so graphic that it brought gasps to the audience. It was unbelievably graphic. A British prosecutor seeking to establish the criminality of the SS read an affidavit from a Dr. Sigmund Rascher, a professor of medicine, who performed unbelievable experiments on inmates at Dachau. The affidavit, which, by the way, if you ever visit Dachau, his experiments are clearly shown in the museum. The affidavit describes an experiment that they used to try to determine the best method of saving a German flyer who might be pulled from the freezing waters of the North Sea. Rascher ordered inmates stripped naked and then throw them into waters of tanks of freezing water. Chunks of ice were added as workers repeatedly thrust thermometers into the rectums of unconscious inmates to see if they were sufficiently chilled. And then when he reached a certain temperature, the victims were pulled out of the tanks to see which of three methods that he had devised for warming might work best. Victims were dropped either into tanks of hot water, warm water, or tepid water. Rascher stated in his affidavit that most of the inmates used in the experiment just went into convulsions and immediately died. Nothing useful was learned, but they kept going with the experiments. This was all read out into the record at Nuremberg. Starting in January of 46, a series of concentration camp victims testified. Maria Claude Courtier, a 33-year-old French woman, provided testimony of something she saw at Auschwitz in 1942. She described how an orchestra of inmates was playing happy tunes as soldiers would separate those destined for slave labor and those that would go straight to be gassed. She told of a night where they woke up to the terrible screams, and the next day they learned that during the course of the night they had run out of gas, but they hadn't run out of people. So they just continued to just burn people alive by throwing them into the furnaces. This was read into the record. On February 18th, the Soviets introduced a film documentary that they had made during the course of the war. The film mostly showed captured German footage, where they were committing endless atrocities in Russia. In one scene, naked women forced into a ditch, made to lie down, and German soldiers standing nearby, laughing and smiling, and then shooting them all. This was the kind of evidence that was making it into the trial. Now, Göring, being the top Nazi on trial, he sort of tried to make himself into the leader of the 21 defendants. From the very beginning of the trial, he took it on himself to try to direct the strategy of his co-defendants. He was sending them notes from the dock to their defense attorneys with suggestions that he was making about points to raise and witnesses to call. Göring had a plan. He thought that he could form a united front and just deny everything and they would get away with it. But of course, he failed. And in the end, it became eventually every man for himself. For example, Schacht, the banker, and von Neurath, the diplomat, they got so mad at Julius Streicher and Kaltenbrunner, they blamed them for having put them into this position in the first place. So they showed nothing but contempt. So Göring's plan started to fall apart. But Göring was incredibly strong of character and had it in his head that he could get his way through this trial if he just with bluff and buster. So when he was testifying, they asked him about all the artwork that he had looted from occupied territories, and the guy had the nerve to act insulted. And he said to them at trial, "Well, it was all gifts. Those were all gifts. No, I didn't steal anything. This was the line that he was taking." Now, he really thought that the Allies would find him innocent, and he actually, at the start of the trials, thought that at the end of the trials, he would be made Germany's first post-war chancellor. A shocking idea that he would survive those trials, but this was what was in his head. When he was being questioned, he was actually able to quite effectively spar against the U.S. Chief Prosecutor, Robert Jackson. And it was right around this time that Churchill really started to have second thoughts about the trials, was beginning to think that, well, maybe we should have had a summary court-martials and executions. That might have been a better idea, but of course that's not what happened. Göring continued on as a completely unrepentant, refused to admit that he'd done anything wrong. During his testimony, he challenged Jackson on the validity of the trial, claiming it was victor's justice. His common refrain was, "Hey, we're just following orders." But the day before Göring's cross-examination, Rudolf Höss, the Auschwitz camp commandant who had been recently captured, was dragged into court to testify and to point to all the Nazis who'd either been to Auschwitz to see what was going on there or who had been in meetings with him when the final solution was being discussed. And his testimony seemed to totally deflate Göring, who must have realized that after Höss showed up and described the carnage of Auschwitz in great detail, that his chance of living past the end of the trial was virtually non-existent. At that point, David Maxwell Fyfe from the UK took over from Jackson, and during his cross-examination of Göring, he finally got Göring to admit that he knew of the murders in the East and that he had also knew and approved of this commissar order. Again, people who touched that commissar order were easily singled out for having committed a war crime. The trial had different impact on Albert Speer, the armaments minister. By the time he was under examination, he was ready to tell the court that he'd made terrible mistakes and was guilty of many crimes. Rudolf Hess adopted a strategy of appearing insane throughout the trial. Under examination, he denied remembering anything and even said he didn't even recognize the other defendants. He was acting totally nuts. But he eventually, too, broke down under cross-examination, and he admitted attending many meetings with Hitler, Göring, and Himmler, where they all sat around planning the invasion of Czechoslovakia and Poland. What saved his life in the end was the fact that he is the guy that stole a plane and flew to Scotland in May of 1941, where he tried to negotiate a peace with the British, an incident that totally reinforced the idea that he had a screw loose. And in fact, he spent the duration of the war sitting in a prison in the UK. Now, some of the defendants just acted confused. They were the ones who were in denial about everything. They desperately just hoped that something would happen that would let them off the hook, that would keep them out of the gallows. They made a point that they were not big cogs in the wheel. They had very little influence on state policy, but that they are just bystanders. Well, of course, in most of these cases, it didn't really work. But one of those that took that position was Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister. Hans Frank took that position. He actually converted to Roman Catholicism after the war, and during his cross-examination, he admitted that 1,000 years shall pass and the guilt of Germany will never be erased. So some of them tried to show some contrition. The prosecution would eventually rest on March the 6th. After 33 witnesses and hundreds of exhibits, no one could deny that the crimes against humanity had been committed by all of these indicted criminals. There were some interesting witnesses I want to talk about. The first one was Admiral Horthy, the regent in Hungary who resigned just as the Nazis began rounding up Hungarian Jews to be sent to Auschwitz, he was one of the major witnesses. Horthy had been the regent in Hungary throughout the war, but in 1944, when the Germans said, we want to round up all of Hungary's Jews and send them off to Auschwitz, he got mad and quit and said, well, you're not going to do that with me here. And he had managed to keep the Nazis at bay throughout much of the war. But in 44, when the Germans decided to do that, he took off. And as a result, the Germans ended up rounding up 500,000 Jews in just 4 months in 1944, and almost all of them ended up in Auschwitz, and most of them ended up as ash. Horthy had opposed Germany's move throughout the war to try to occupy Hungary, and of course, as I said, he resigned in protest. When he resigned, he took off to Switzerland, and his son was actually arrested by the SS, and the son spent the rest of the war in Dachau. The Austrian pre-war Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, who at one point first agreed to join the Union with Germany as an independent state, soon found that Hitler had other ideas for the Anschluss, and he simply wanted to absorb Austria into a broader German empire. When Schuschnigg figured this out, he too resigned, and he actually spent the entire war, first in Sachsenhausen and then in Dachau. He was nearly murdered by Kaltenbrunner at the end of the war because he was one of the 140 notable hostages that Kaltenbrunner had been trying to trade to the Allies in exchange for his own miserable life. It turns out Horthy's son was also one of those that was on that bus. Also on that bus, if you remember, Martin Niemöller, the minister, the Lutheran minister, who also was in Dachau, he ended up there too. You could maybe remember that poem from the other day. Next week, when I talk about the Germans who tried to resist Hitler, you're going to be introduced to a number of others who were on that bus. But Schuschnigg's testimony was particularly damaging to Göring and von Papen, who had both tried so hard to convince him that Hitler wasn't really going to start a war of aggression. All right, so what about the outcomes of the trial? Okay, here we go. Now, here's how you read this. These are the crimes listed up here. These are the defendants listed down the side. This is each crime. Count 1 would be a crime against peace. Count 2 would be planning the war of aggression, etc. If there's an I, it means they were indicted and not convicted. If there's a blank, it means that they weren't indicted. And if there's a G, it means they were found guilty. What the sentence is listed here as the penalty. And then there's a note that indicates if something interesting happened to them. So as with Bormann, who was tried in absentia, he actually was given a death sentence for having been found guilty of counts 3 and counts 4. Turns out, although they thought he had escaped to South America, it turns out that he never got out of Berlin when the Russians invaded, and they eventually found his remains in a ditch in Berlin in 1972. But this is what happened to all of the others. Dönitz was found guilty of 2 and 3. Hans Frank, you can read it yourself. Now, what's interesting about some of these is how many death sentences. Well, you can see here, he got the death sentence. Frank, Frick, Göring, of course, Jodl, Kaltenbrunner, the SS guy, Keitel. Some of them had no decision. Of course, this was because Gustav Krupp, even though he was indicted, turns out he was in a coma. Robert Ley, of course, this is the guy who committed suicide. Ribbentrop, Rosenberg, and Sokol all got the death penalty, and as did Seyss Inquart and Julius Streicher. Albert Speer spent many years in Spandau prison and was released in October of 1966. The other guy who ended up in Spandau was Hess. He actually committed suicide in 87. He was given a life sentence. Spandau in Berlin now has been converted into an artist colony, a really beautiful artist colony. It used to be a fortress. That's why it would have been used as a prison. It's now actually been turned into an artist colony. Now, the people that were hanged were, as you can see, all mostly hung on the 16th of October of 1946. And they were all hung by this guy, John C. Woods, who was the executioner for all these war crimes trial guilty people. It turns out he ended up hanging about 45 war criminals, including some of the people from other trials. The guy was from Wichita, Kansas, and turns out this guy was a bit of a character, not exactly a model soldier, joined the Navy in 1929, went AWOL, discharged in 1930, rejoined the army in 1943, volunteered when the army started looking for a hangman. He told the army that he had experience as a hangman. Turns out, not so much. He had no experience as a hangman, but he managed to gain quite a bit of experience during the war. And of course, there's many stories of his efforts being the fact that he wasn't very experienced. Some of these people were hanging from the rope for quite some time before they were finally declared dead, but I don't think too many people are going to worry too much about that. But he actually was responsible for also executing the death penalty against Americans who were committed to, or who were convicted of capital crimes in Europe during the course of the war, and he was responsible also for hanging 34 American soldiers. Turns out, after the war, as you can see, by the way, he made it, his face made it into a magazine, World War II magazine that you can see here. And also after the war, he stayed in the army during a period in 1950 when he was in a Weetalk. He actually managed to accidentally electrocute himself when he was working on an electrical panel. But that was the end of the hangman who was there at Nuremberg. Now, that was it for the military tribunal set up for the four powers. The Allied powers also held an international military tribunal in Asia. In that trial, that they used judges from all around the world. In fact, they had 14 judges and from 14 different countries, as opposed to the 4 that had been used in Nuremberg. And you can imagine how much added trouble that caused. But we don't have time today to talk about the war crimes trials in Asia. That might be for another time. Let's stick to Europe because we're not quite done yet. After the IMT was completed, the four powers had 4 different reactions. Stalin wasn't really interested in having any more trials. He was still holding on to more than 200,000 German POWs. The few that survived the Gulag didn't return actually to Germany until the 1950s. That's another war crime, by the way, that went unpunished. The French left before someone brought up their behavior of the Vichy government. And as you know, there was never a trial to hold the Vichy to account for anything, and certainly not for running their own concentration camp called Nutzweiler, which is near Strasbourg. The British would hold their own military tribunals in the British occupied zone in Germany. I'm going to point to some of the trials that they did. The Poles would hold a series of trials as well, and the U.S. did as well. Now, it just so happened that Nuremberg was in the U.S. zone of occupation, and so the U.S. trials were held at the very same Palace of Justice in the very same courtroom and occurred during the years of 1946 and 1949. So let's talk a little bit about what the U.S. did. The U.S. decided that they were not going to give up on war crimes trials, and so what did they do? They decided to go after certain groups. Here's a list in this slide that shows all the different trials that the U.S. ran. They ran a doctor's trial. They ran a trial against a guy named Milch who worked for Field Marshal Goring. He worked for Goring. He was his supply minister, actually. They ran a judge's trial. Now, of course, many of you who've seen the movie Judgment at Nuremberg will know the judge's trial. This is the movie with Spencer Tracy, made famous over the years. And 16 judges were tried, put on trial for their role in this whole affair. That was in 47. There's the Pole trial with a bunch of SS officers. Flick, which was a company in Germany, they were put on trial with a number of their directors. The Farben trial is quite a famous trial. We're going to talk a little bit about IG Farben. They were the maker of Zyklon B, got their own trial. There was a hostages trial with German generals from the Balkans, an RUSHA trial that had to do with racial cleansing. Einsatzgruppen, which we talked about in the past. The Krupp trial, which was the trial that the son ended up having to defend himself in, and a ministry's trial and a high command trial. So let's talk a little bit about some of these trials. Okay, first the doctor's trial. This one's interesting because these crimes actually go all the way back to the very start of the war when these doctors got involved in the T4 euthanasia program. But these were the crimes that they were charged with. War crimes and crimes against humanity, war crimes, medical experiments, and euthanasia. Aha, this is where they tried to show the German people that these people were murdering their own sick and infirm. And so they put them on trial for that. And then, of course, crimes against humanity. And as you probably are aware, being a member of the SS was actually made a crime. So some of them were charged with that. Again, these are the names of the defendants. This is the charges, and again, whether or not they were found guilty. And of course, you can see which ones here were given the death penalty. So you can see the U.S. was trying to go after people that they felt were involved in doing things that were sadistic in nature and deserved them to be put on trial for these various crimes. And they had various differing results as a result of it. Some of them were acquitted, many of them put to death, some of them were given prison sentences. Many of them were released before the prison sentences were actually fully served. Many times this happened. In some cases, sentences were commuted. Why? Because at this time, again, the U.S. was already trying to garner the support of Germans in what was going to become a Cold War against the Russians. So we needed the cooperation of Germany. The other point to make on this page is somehow the U.S. managed to leave Joseph Mengele off of this list. But the guy from Dachau was on here, the guy that committed those crimes. He got tried. Okay, so this is back to the list again. I want to show you a couple more of these. The next guy is this Milch trial. This one is quite interesting. This Milch guy, he got his very own trial, charged with war crimes and slave labor, participating in fatal medical experiments, and slave labor and fatal experiments on Germans and others. Turns out he was a friend of Göring's from World War I, had been in the Air Force with Göring during World War I, which is how Göring got to be the Reichsminister for Air during World War II. He'd been a pilot in World War I, and Milch had been his buddy in World War I. Milch became his Minister of Supply in World War II. During the trial, he was defended by his brother. Milch's brother defended him. The trial happened here in 1947, found guilty of counts 1 and 3, tried to get a writ of habeas corpus, which caused Robert Jackson to refuse himself. Ultimately, at the end of the trial, the guy was sentenced to 15 years. So 15 years from 1947 is 1962, managed to get himself paroled in 1954. Why am I talking about this guy? He's quite interesting. I never heard of this guy until I was working on this presentation several years ago. Why is he interesting? He was Jewish. Now that's interesting. Turns out Göring had a Jewish friend from World War I who he decided to try to protect during World War II. And Göring, at one point, when Milch was being chased by the SS as being Jewish and they wanted to throw him into jail, do away with him and his family, Göring famously stood up and said, "I will define and tell you who is a Jew and who is not a Jew." So he managed to save Milch's life and managed to save the life of his family because his brother was around at the end of the war to defend him. But that's the story of Milch. Unfortunately, I've not been able to find a book about this guy. Must be quite an interesting story. I'm sure he had a very interesting post-war life. His family dinners must have been rather interesting to attend. Now, this is back to the list. I want to talk about a couple more. The Farben trial is quite interesting. And so let's just talk a little bit about this. IG Farben had a headquarters in Frankfurt. Huge building that you can see here in the picture. This building was used by Eisenhower after the war as his headquarters for all of occupied Europe. It had managed to survive bombings and survived intact. Out in front of the building today is a plaque that describes its role in Nazi Germany. And in fact, the building today is actually owned by the Johannes Goethe University. So it's a university building. And when I was walking around in there, it's filled with university students. Of course, on the plaque here, it describes that Zyklon B was actually developed in the basement. I was dying to talk to some of them about whether they knew that Zyklon B was actually developed in the basement of the building where they were going to university, but I never managed to do that. But this is where it happened. Now, what did they do to IG Farben? Well, they threw the management on trial, charged them with these crimes, 24 defendants, 10 of them were acquitted, 13 were found guilty, and 1 was dismissed when he was sick. But this was a huge industrial conglomerate that had been, before the war, using the Haber-Bosch process, which is a very famous process that was developed by the Germans for making fertilizer and used all over the world, still used today all over the world, by the way. for making fertilizer. But they also were manufacturing Zyklon B. They also built a huge synthetic rubber plant that's called Buna, that's the name for it, that they built at Auschwitz called Monowitz, but it was never put into production. However, in building the plant, many people died there as slave labor. The company was actually broken up after the war. And now you've heard of many of these, maybe all of these companies, but Bayer, BASF, these companies were at one point all called IG Farben, AGFA, and Host Celanese, and many others were all part of IG Farben. It was a very big company. The breakup of the company caused a 50-year fight with survivors for reparations. Eventually, they tried to build a foundation and fund it for reparations, which was a rather small amount of money. So they've been ducking their responsibility. There's also been a 50-year fight with the shareholders who felt cheated out of their investment. This is the only company that the Allies broke into pieces after the war. And in fact, their stock continued to trade in Germany and Frankfurt, even though it wasn't legal to do so. But under protest, they were still trading the stock until 2012 when they finally got it removed from the stock exchange. They still have an annual general meeting where the shareholders or the offspring of the shareholders get together to protest the fact that their assets were all liquidated and the company, which really no longer exists anymore. But the longest sentence was 8 years for the Chemical Warfare Committee and the construction of the plant at Monowitz. Now, there also were some trials that happened at the camps. So after the war, the Allies decided they were going to try to actually have a trial for each specific camp. There was a trial in Auschwitz put on by the Poles. That's what the P means. In November of 47, you can see what they managed to accomplish here. Bergen-Belsen, another camp, was in the British zone. The British had a trial in 45 with these results. Belzec, the Germans tried to try people in 63, 8 members of the SS. Look what happened. All were set free. In Chelmno, which you've heard of from our discussions, both the Soviets and the Poles tried to have a trial. So one person who was sentenced to death ultimately set free. So you can see things are not going too well at some of these trials. The Americans had a trial at Dachau about the Dachau camp. 40 were tried, including Martin Weiss and Klaus Schilling. You can look up their histories, but 23 of the 40 were hung. And then a very interesting trial was put on here by the Germans in Frankfurt over Auschwitz, again in 1963 to 1965, where they got some results with people getting convicted and sentenced to either 4 years to life. The person who put the trial together was a guy named Fritz Bauer. Now, if you've seen the movie Labyrinth of Lies, Fritz Bauer is the person who that movie is about. There's also a second movie to watch called The People versus Fritz Bauer, which is also about this trial. Bauer is famous for having survived the war. He was Jewish. He was a lawyer before the war. He took off and spent the war in Sweden and came back after the war and was running one of the prosecutor's offices in one of the provinces in northern Germany. And he decided to try to have this trial of Auschwitz camp guards in the 60s. He also is responsible for tipping off the Israelis that Eichmann was actually in Argentina, and probably responsible for tipping them off that Mengele was in Paraguay, even though the Israelis chose to just leave South America with just Eichmann and not try to grab Mengele at the same time when they might have had a chance to do so. But these trials all occurred after the war, and the Poles had their own trials, one of which I mentioned here on the previous slide. This Auschwitz trial was part of the Polish effort. So here's the full Polish effort. The Poles had what they called the Supreme National Tribunal, where they tried to come to grips with some of these things. And the first thing they did is that they declared that the general government that took the German Nazi general government was actually a criminal institution. So that's the first thing that they did, and that set them up with a series of 10 trials. Now, this gentleman came up, I can use that name, gentleman, but he probably wasn't. Ludwig Plog came up in a question from a week or two ago. I tracked him down. It turns out Ludwig Plog was included in the Auschwitz trial, number 5, 40 staff from Auschwitz, which is that trial also from the page I just showed you. Liebe Henschel was one of the camp commandants. 23 of them were killed, were put to death. I mean, that's what I mean by that. And one person was acquitted. Now, the red here means that the person who was put on trial was actually executed and put to death. Greiser was put to death. Goth, Ammon Goth. I'm sure some of you remember Schindler's List. Ammon Goth was the commandant there at Plazau. He was tried in August of 46. This is the guy who was famously shooting people from his balcony in the scene from the movie at the start of the movie. Put to death in 46. And you can see what happened to the rest of these people. Haas was the main commandant in Auschwitz, and he was put to death in 47. And you can see what happened to these other folks. But this Ludwig Plog was part of the Auschwitz Guard group. He also was a member of the Lebensborn, which I just was mentioning a little while ago. He went to Norway and had some offspring with a Norwegian girl. At the end, he was begging for his life. Even though he'd been responsible for gassing thousands of Jews, Sinti, and Roma. And he's one of the ones that was actually put to death. A little bit about Haas. He was tried by the Poles in 47, and you can see him down here being hung. He was hung at Auschwitz, right inside the main camp. There's a crematorium, and he was hung right beside it. So now, what are the traditions that live on as a result of Nuremberg? Well, first of all, the UN Charter, multiple Geneva Conventions, certainly the International Criminal Court can trace its history back to this. Even nuclear test ban treaties call on the jurisprudence from the Nuremberg trials, the Treaty on Prohibiting Chemical Weapons, and of course many others. But they've all grown out of what happened at Nuremberg. So we can say, it's debatable if the world is more peaceful as a result of the Nuremberg trials, but we can definitely say that the Nuremberg trials ignited a tradition of the world actually trying to address some of these wrongs and trying to do something about it, rather than just sitting around and letting these things happen over and over and over again with no consequences. And with that, let's open it up for some questions.
There's one question, Richard, in the Q&A box asking, Beverly Rowland is asking why Goebbels was not indicted in the trial.
Dead. He took poison. So they caught up with, Goebbels killed himself in Hitler's bunker just before the end of the war. So he was dead. Himmler also was captured in the West by the British, and he actually bit down on a capsule of cyanide, so he was not around to be tried either. But Goebbels was in the bunker. If you ever saw the movie Downfall, Goebbels' wife actually fed poison to all her kids. I think she had 5 or 6 kids. I don't remember exactly. And then she and her husband both took poison themselves, or I think maybe they shot themselves. I can't remember. But anyway, they didn't survive the bunker. And Himmler died in a forest, or he was dumped in a forest in the western part of Germany. In the northern part, where the British, in the British zone, when he was interrogated, he had a capsule of cyanide in his teeth, and he bit down on that.
Okay, now David is asking, and I thought the same thing when I saw the name Alfred Rosenberg. Sounds like a Jewish name. David is asking, was he a Jew?
Yeah, no, Rosenberg, when you hear it here in the U.S., it does sound like a Jewish name, but it's not. It also can be a German name, so no, he was not.
Sure.
Yeah.
And Jane is asking, what finally happened to Mengele?
So nobody really knows for sure, but the common belief is that he died in Paraguay without being either brought to justice by anybody. There's always been rumors that maybe somebody whacked him, killed him, but I think it's more likely that he may have just died of old age, and he's buried somewhere in Paraguay. His family, guaranteed, 100%, the guy's family knows what happened to him, but of course the family not talking.
Well, Nancy's wondering why Mengele wasn't more pursued.
Yeah, so it's a good question. In the early 60s, so we learned in last week about Simon Wiesenthal, who spent a great deal of time after the war trying to hunt down Nazis. there were people who were desperately trying to hunt down Nazis. Serge Klarsfeld was a French Jewish guy who basically was doing what Simon Wiesenthal was doing. He and his wife, whose name I can't remember at the moment, Beta Klarsfeld, I think might have been her name. And prosecutors like Fritz Bauer were trying to bring these people to justice. But, you know, the world after World War II was mostly focusing on other problems. These things had already happened, and there wasn't much you could do about it. There weren't very much interest on the part of governments to do much about tracking down these Nazis. Many of these Nazis were involved in running the German government, so getting them out of the government in Germany was a problem. Fritz Bauer ran into this problem all the time. If you want to watch those movies, you'll see exactly how much opposition he had in order to try to have that Auschwitz trial. The Israelis themselves, who you would think would have wanted to track these people down, well, for sure, the Israelis did want to track those people down. But, of course, the Israelis had their own problems, that being they were in a war of with 100 million of their neighbors who were trying to kill them. So they could decide how much time they were in effort they were going to spend on tracking down Nazis from World War II, or spend their time and effort trying to fend off 100 million people who were trying to slit their throats in 1960. So they were obviously torn. Now, they did decide when they got definitive word of where Eichmann was, which we think now came from Fritz Bauer, they actually went after him. They flew to Argentina and tracked him down, kidnapped him, threw him in a plane and flew back to Israel, where, as you know, they put him on trial and executed him. But that's the only one of those people that they did. Now, Simon Wiesenthal has been responsible for tracking down many people over the years. Of course, he's passed on now, as did Klarsfeld, Klaus Barbie being one of them. But a lot of these people just got away with it. You know, if you look at the list of people who were tried at Nuremberg and all the subsequent trials, it's a few hundred. Now, there's just no way a few hundred people are responsible for murdering the millions that died during World War II. So there were a lot more, and, you know, a lot of them got away with it. And this is just a sad fact of life. Now, of course, the United States' hands is not totally clean either, given the fact that, as we learned, we had folks who were in our employ building rockets for the Apollo program, who all had been involved in Peenemünde, and many of them involved in war crimes of their own, who we snatched up at the end of the war and put to work on sending a man to the moon. You know, and we talked about that a few weeks ago as well. So those folks, Arthur Rudolph, and I'm spacing on the other guy's name. See, I can't remember his name. I think that's a good thing that I can't remember his name, because, of course, we wouldn't want that guy to be honored. But they worked for the Allies for many years for the United States. You know, eventually they either were booted out of the country, like Arthur Rudolph, for being a miscreant who had been involved in killing people at Nordhausen, or they just faded away into oblivion, like the other guy, who maybe somebody can remember his name and type it into the chat, because I feel like an idiot because I can't remember his name. But it's on the tip of my tongue. But anyway, you know, we let some of these people get away with it too.
Okay, there's quite a number of questions in the Q&A box, and it's 20 to 11, but we will continue until we can answer these, if people can stay. Linda Davis asked, were there women tried and convicted in any of the trials?
There were women who were, if I go back to the presentation, the British had a trial at Ravensbrück, and there were women guards who were put on trial there. So yes, there were. I'm not sure if any of them, well, wait a minute, let me just flip back in my slides here, and I can see quickly if any of them were put to death. I'm guessing they didn't have the fortitude to put women to death. Let's see. This shows that they had 7 different trials, 38. Oh no, this says that they hung a couple of women. 16 people were hung as a result of the Ravensbrück trial that was put on by the British, including a couple of women. So there were a few that were put to death.
A couple of people remembered the person that you can't remember. Is it Werner von Braun?
Yes, yeah, very exactly, von Braun. Thank you. And now I don't feel quite so stupid. Von Braun.
Okay.
Right.
So again, some specific questions about Elie Wiesel's work. What are the results? Beverly asked, what are the results of Elie Wiesel?
Yeah, so Elie Wiesel, he survived the war. He actually spent a lot of time in Buchenwald. That's where he spent the most of his time. He survived as a little kid, right? He was like a child, I don't know, 10 or so when he, at the end of the war, maybe 11, I'm not sure. Of course, he went on to be a very famous writer who wrote about his experiences, a book that's widely read by everybody. I'm not sure I've met too many people who haven't cracked the spine on that book. Of course, it's about his experiences and what he thought of the whole thing, and his experiences in life. He became obviously a very famous author and spoke eloquently on his experiences in the Holocaust throughout his entire life, as did many of the other people. He was there with a bunch of other kids at Buchenwald, and there's a very interesting documentary called "The Boys from Buchenwald" that's on Netflix or Amazon Prime. That maybe you can find it. That's about him and these other guys, these other kids who all managed to survive their time in the camps. But he did not spend his time trying to track down Nazis after the war. His interest was in speaking out about the Holocaust and trying to make sure another Holocaust never happened again.
A couple of questions about other companies or efforts that were complicit with the Nazis, you might say. Do you know the role of the German company Degussa, and were any of the Vichy French tried?
So Degussa was a subsidiary. I do know about Degussa. In fact, I know that company very well. Degussa still exists today, actually. It's a chemical company. Degussa is actually the subsidiary of IG Farben that was producing it started out as a pesticide, right? Zyklon B was developed as a pesticide, but actually it was two people at Degussa whose names I used to know. It's in another one of my presentations. They were salespeople for Degussa, and they are the ones that came up with the idea that if it works so well as a poison against varmints, it would work for humans. And so it was these two people who were promoting it. Of course, Degussa, the company, never stopped them from doing it. And in fact, of course, they were happy to produce it for the Nazis. And this was a subsidiary of IG Farben. Degussa, again, was broken up after the war. They somehow managed to keep their name. I don't know why. They're still around, or at least they were a few years ago, selling chemicals. In fact, when I was in Auschwitz, I remember being in Krakow, driving around, and I saw a sign for the chemical company Degussa that had some sort of office in Krakow, which is the city right next to where Auschwitz is located, which is more than just a little ironic. Actually, I met a guy who worked for Degussa. He had no idea that his company had a history like that. But of course, he had nothing to do with it since this was just like 10 years ago. But yeah, these companies all still exist. Bayer, Agfa, they're all still around. BASF, these are huge companies to this day. And they all were split off by the Allies when they broke up IG Farben. Now, you asked also about the Vichy. Well, other than Klaus Barbie, who was a member sort of the Vichy government, who was busy running around murdering people and rounding them up and sending them to Natzweiler, especially a bunch of kids. He's very famous for rounding up a bunch of kids and sending them off to the camps. He was tried, but this was like 50 years after the fact. So the guy managed to have a life after the war where he was not put to death. So he got some measure of justice, but you can argue whether or not these people were allowed to live a happy life and only were tracked down at the end of their lives, which is why it's always funny to hear about, finding a camp guard who's being prosecuted in 2010. Come on, really? Where's the person's been living a life since 1945 on the run, and now that they're 95, you're going to track them down and try them as a war criminal? Where was the effort in 1946? And how was it exactly that they managed to get here to the United States in the first place? People like John Demjanjuk, the guy who was in Cleveland that was eventually deported back to Germany for being a camp guard. The reality is that these people should never have been allowed into the United States. If they were allowed in, they should have been tracked down by our own government and prosecuted and thrown out and put on trial. But, we had other interests at the time. We had a Cold War that we had to deal with in the Russians, and it just was not a priority. So this is what happens.
Okay, from William Buchholz, an interesting question about Germany's discipline and record keeping. If the Russians had kept such records, would they too have been indicted?
Well, no, because we got a hold of the Germans' records because we occupied Germany. So we just had to go to the warehouse where the records were stored, and we could have at it, and we did. We sent in people, and the records were all sitting there. Meticulous records, the names of people that were put onto deportation trains, all beautifully written on forms. This is the German penchant for keeping track of stuff, and of course it got a lot of them into trouble. And those records were all captured when, of course, we occupied Germany. Well, we never occupied Russia, so we never really had access to the Russian records. Of course, we already knew that the Russian military had murdered the Polish officer corps in the Kachin Forest, but in order to prosecute the Russian perpetrators, we would have had to invade Russia. Well, we didn't do that, and we were highly unlikely to do that. So the reality is that they got away with it, and they weren't interested in prosecuting these people themselves, primarily because they were the ones who were in power after the war in Russia were the ones who committed the crime. So, never happened. And of course, the Poles, if you talk to Poles about this, the Poles, they just hate the Russians with the power of 1,000 suns. In fact, most Poles, I think, spend their evenings in their basement sharpening a knife, hoping that the Russians will try to come back at one point so that they can extract some measure of revenge for how they were treated both during the war and after the war. So.
Well, speaking about Russia, Maureen Scanlon asks, is the present-day Russian aggression a war crime?
Well, that's a good question. They invaded the Crimea. They did not declare war. We've talked about that today. Did they commit crimes there? Arguably, what they're doing in the eastern part of Ukraine, you could make a case that it's a war crime. Sure, I don't see why not. They launched a war of aggression against their neighbor. Of course, they're using a proxy, right? These are not Russian soldiers, so they will deny this. But, this is why it gets really complicated. But yeah, sure. Are they obviously guilty for being involved in whatever's going on in the Ukraine, retaking the Crimea and then invading the eastern part of the Ukraine? Sure. Now, are you going to be able to drag them into court? No chance, right? This is sadly the case, is that you can have these laws on the books, but enforcing them is, very difficult, right? Obviously. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons why the International Criminal Court is always putting African dictators on trial and nobody else, because, of course, they can get their hands on an African dictator. Very hard to get their hands on most of these other people. So, it's very difficult. This universal justice is pretty hard to guarantee on this planet.
Okay, we want to quit by 11, but we have 8 minutes left for a couple more questions. Bertha asks about the Commissar's order. Can you define what that was?
Sure. So when they invaded east into Russia, the Germans decided, as I said, they were going to kill the political officers who were embedded in the Russian military. They obviously had a long-standing feud with communism. The natural enemy of fascism wasn't capitalism. It was actually communism. They were at each other's throats for most of the period between the two wars. And when Germany invaded Russia, they wanted to kill the communists, the Bolsheviks. And their idea of how to achieve this was to murder every Bolshevik they came across. So partisans were, by definition, Bolsheviks, immediately executed. The commissars, who were embedded in the Russian army, by definition, they were communists, immediately executed. And of course, it's illegal to execute POWs. This is definitely a war crime. So when they wrote this commissar order, which basically said when you get your hands on prisoners of war, weed out the commissars and execute them, give them summarily, which is what the Germans were doing. And this order flowed from the high command to field level generals, to colonels and majors and captains and lieutenants. So all those people in the chain that passed along that commissar order actually were apt to be convicted or tried for having touched the commissar order and potentially get convicted for it in a war crimes tribunal. Now, they didn't go after the lower ranks, right? We've already talked about that. But many of the men in the upper ranks who touched that commissar order, especially right at the top at the high command level, who either wrote it or were the first ones to pass it along, that were on our list today, or in one of these other trials, they were actually charged with having touched that commissar order, and that got them convicted of that crime. Now, whether or not they were put to death for it or not was a subject of the trials that you saw here today.
Well, okay, I'm going to copy whatever's left over like I have in the past for those that are still on the phone call, on the Zoom call. But here's an interesting follow-up on the German mating program in Sweden. Linda asked, can you tell us more about the descendants of that Lebensborn?
Yeah, not Sweden, Norway. It was in Norway. And Sweden was neutral, so the Germans were not running around impregnating Swedish girls. These were Norwegians. Norway was occupied by the Germans. And of course, with fighting a war on all these fronts, somebody figured out they might need more Germans. So the only way to get them, well, there's a couple of ways to get them. First of all, you could kidnap all the ones that looked Aryan from the countries that you occupied, which they were doing, and even their kids, and they were taking them back to Germany and giving the kids to Aryan families to raise. Of course, there's a limited number of Aryan-looking kids in all these countries, so they ran out, or they didn't find enough, or they wanted even more. So the only other way to get more Aryans is to make them. So of course they had programs in Germany to try to increase the birth rate amongst German populations. But in order to make it more interesting for some of the men who weren't actually married, they said, well, hey, why don't you go to Norway and pick yourself out a nice Norwegian girl, and you can have kids with them. And so that's where this Lebensborn program came from. And as I mentioned today, one of those people who were born in that program actually had pretty crappy lives in Norway. They were shunned by their neighbors. Their mothers, who were the ones that were impregnated, were often treated as collaborating Norwegians, whether they were collaborating or not. Many of them were just scooped up and had no choice, so i.e. they were raped. So the mothers and then the kids who were born from that Lebensborn program often had very miserable lives and had to move to get away from their neighbors. Europeans often live in villages and they've known each other for hundreds of years. And when one of these women girls got themselves pregnant by a German, it was okay during the war, but when the war ended and it was time for retaliation, the whole thing fell apart. They had to basically leave home. Many of them were hounded, in some cases out of the country. In fact, the woman from ABBA, the blonde from ABBA, who was a part of the Lebensborn program, she was the kid. Her mother moved her and the kid, the member from ABBA, to Sweden. They had to get away from Norway, so they actually moved away from their hometown. The mother never managed to find her own way, died very unhappy, and then the daughter, joined that band. But there were thousands more, and they almost all universally were shunned by the Norwegians after the war and had pretty miserable existences until, of course, they were able to grow up and move away and make their own story of their life. And not all their stories ended unhappily, but I'm sure for their mothers it was very difficult after the war. So this was a program that was run not only in Norway, but I think they were doing it in Poland as well, and even in France, especially in the Saar, in the area. They were doing it there because there's a lot of intermingling of French and Germans in the Saar, and also in the area around Alsace, which is where Strasbourg's at. This was happening there too.
Well, okay. You know what? Ollie wants us to close at 11, so I'm capturing the leftover. There's 5 open questions
Okay.
They're pretty complicated. Japanese trials and a couple of specific questions about folks and a movie. So let's save those, and you can share them next week.
Okay. All right.
Thank
Maybe
you.
we can go extra long next week, since that's the last week. Talk to the OLLI people. By the way, next week, just to, if you're thinking about not attending next week's session, I would encourage you to actually attend it, because this story is the least known of all the things I've talked about. And I have found it to be one of the more interesting stories. The people I'm going to introduce you to next week, in almost every case, had they not been murdered by the Germans at the end of the war, we would know them as common household names. They would have all had high positions in a post-war German government, especially if they had managed to succeed in killing Hitler, which they tried to do in July of '44. But even if they hadn't, just having survived the war and been in opposition to him, they would have been leading political figures in a post-war Germany, had they all not been executed. So I guess I kind of buried the lead, but it's still a very interesting story. And you should actually attend next week, I hope, if you have time.
Okay, we're looking forward to it. Thanks, Richard. Everybody stay safe.
Bye-bye.
We'll let Christine close us up. Okay, doke.